The stuff that I'm talking about today is more like me and my previous career, I suppose, more than it is specifically in Unharm things. So my background is in strategic research, especially to inform communications campaigns. That light is very bright. All right, so I'll get started. I'm going to talk about Australian attitudes to drugs and drug policy and the implications for drug law reform campaigning in Australia. And one of the things I'm going to try and do is draw some conclusions about the kinds of messages that cut through to the people that we need on side in order to make change. I'm going to look at Australian attitudes and the implications of those, and then I'm going to compare Australia with the US and look at some of the research that's been done there in relation to cannabis regulation and also drug law reform more generally about what messages cut through to Americans. All right, so Australian attitudes to drugs and drug policy and what it all means. I'm going to start out with the bad news. On the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, which is asked of about 20,000 Australians every 3 years, one of the questions that's asked is, do you approve of the regular use of drugs by an adult? And people do not approve. Now, I just see that I wrote this in Microsoft and it's now displayed in Apple, so all those are the proportions, but they're expressed as fractions of one. Nevertheless, the main point here is that people do not approve of regular use of illicit drugs. The one that's gone missing here is alcohol. 55% of people also say they don't approve of the regular use of alcohol by adults. But does anyone in the audience like cannabis? Yeah? Does anyone in the audience love cannabis? Yeah, all right. I'm part of that group too. Most people are not part of that group. 90% of people say that they do not approve of the regular use of cannabis by an adult. All right. So here's a second question. It's from the same survey. How would you describe the approach to drug law enforcement in Australia? Again, this proportion's been rendered as a fraction of one. So 60% of people say drug law enforcement in Australia is too soft. They've been asked to reply on a scale that goes from too soft to about right to too tough. And that is pretty similar if you vote Labor. It's even higher if you vote Liberal Nationals. Only the Green voters are quite different from the general population on that question. And what I think this means is that people are clearly concerned about illicit drugs. We've seen that in the previous slide. But they're also dissatisfied with what's happening right now. Right now that's being expressed as wanting more of the same, but it's a real opportunity as well, I think. Here we have concern with drug use, dissatisfaction with what's happening right now, and that's an opportunity for us. All right, so let's look specifically at attitudes to cannabis in Australia. What do people think about cannabis? Well, these slides are completely unformatted, and so who's doing the tech support? Do you have a Windows computer? I'll keep talking through these slides, but if you've got a Windows... Yeah, that'd be great. Look, the slides are really an illustration of the talk, so I'll just keep talking, and we'll... what this slide is showing is... down here you've got the proportions of people who support the legalisation of cannabis, the legalisation of cannabis use by adults. Now in Australia, about 30% of people, 32% I think to be precise, support the legalisation of cannabis for personal use by adults. That puts us about where the United States was about 12 years ago. When you ask the question, what should happen to a person who's found in possession of a small quantity of cannabis, about 70% of people say something that isn't a criminal penalty. So they say something between no action at all, on the one hand, or a diversion into a health program. So framed in those terms, 70% of people are already there. They already support the idea that we should stop criminalising cannabis consumers. There you go. I assure you it looks much better in the other presentation, which we'll get to in a sec. All right, So one of the surprises, you know, I'm talking specifically about cannabis here, where we've got 70% of people saying, I don't support criminalisation of cannabis consumers. When we look across the different drug types, methamphetamine, ecstasy, heroin, and hallucinogens are the 4 other questions that Australians are asked about. More than 50% of people for all those drugs will say that they don't support the criminalisation of consumers. So there's a huge opportunity here for us. People are already there. You know, we spend, I think, a lot of time thinking about the need to change people's minds. We have to change what people think about drugs. But here's an opportunity where people are already right there, and it's an opportunity where we can make that majority already existing more visible, engage them with the idea of actually making a difference.
Happening.
Okay. Can you
And his thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just continue. I'll paint pictures for you, hopefully with words. So despite, sorry, what? Oh, thank you. So despite the fact that most people are already there saying that they don't support the criminalisation of consumers of all the main categories of illicit drugs in Australia, are the police reducing their law enforcement pressure on drug consumers? Okay, obviously that's a rhetorical question. They are not. And over the last 10 to 12 years, we've in fact seen the number of drug consumer arrests in Australia increase from about 60,000 to about 80,000. About 83,000 Australians are arrested every year for a cannabis consumer offence, as in possession of a small quantity of drugs or consumption of drugs.
Now, the talk is what is entitled.
Okay.
Nimbin 15.
Question is great because I need a little guidance from my slides about what I was going to say next.
Yeah.
That is across 2001 through to 2013. So the last 12 years. Yeah, sure. Yep.
Yeah, that's the first one that he had up.
Good. I can present it to all. Hang on.
Sorry.
Yep.
Go present it to all. Review. Present it to all. Just forward through that. Where was he up to?
Past there.
Yeah.
Past there.
So that terminology doesn't
it was there.
make that much of a difference, but I agree with the concept. That is, when you ask people what should happen to a person found in possession of drugs, they do, in what they say, oh, right, here we go. Here we are back in Microsoft land. I'm sorry about that. Oh, yeah. Oh, we need it on slideshow, though. Thank you. So this data is from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, which the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare does. It's the big Australian survey of drug use and attitudes to drugs. There are other surveys that have been done where people are asked about decriminalisation. The figures are actually quite similar, whether you ask about legalisation or decriminalisation. Where you see the real difference is when you actually ask people to say what they think should happen. And when they actually have to think, oh, what should happen to that person who's found with a small quantity of cannabis? That's when they are much more likely to say, we shouldn't be criminalising that person. The words themselves, people are a bit iffy with. The concepts, though, clearly they support. Fantastic, here we go. All right, so here we are across all drugs. Right, big opportunity. We've got majorities already right there with us saying we should not be criminalising consumers of these drugs. And here's the figures. Okay, so this is Australian Crime Commission data. We are arresting 80,000 Australians every year for possession of small quantities of cannabis. Mostly 65% of those people are arrested for a cannabis possession offence. So, what I am suggesting here is that there's a big opportunity for campaigning on this particular issue to say we should stop criminalising the users of illicit drugs. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the other messages, but nevertheless, first of all, why stop criminalising consumers? Well, we've got great evidence that ending criminalisation increases social engagement and access into treatment for people who want it. There's nothing, the stigmatisation that comes from using an illicit drug pushes people away from treatment if they need it. And, and so in effect increases the social and health harms from drug consumption. Stopping criminalising users would involve no longer arresting those 80,000 people a year, therefore freeing up resources for programs that work. It would reduce the social burden of law enforcement, which is trying to be a subtle way of expressing the fact that arresting consumers to us all involves a massive intrusion of the state into our personal liberties. Now, when you say that to most voters, they don't really care about our personal liberties. But this is an attempt to express that in terms that might be more palatable to people. And lastly, for those of us in the cannabis community, I think that an ending the criminalisation of consumers that included cannabis home grow and removed criminal penalties from non-financial exchanges of cannabis would go a long way toward addressing some of the desires that we have for reform in relation to cannabis. It would also, for people who are more concerned about the amount of money that Australian criminal networks make from illicit drug sales, would also like the fact that ending criminalisation of home grows is going to remove a major source of revenue from the violent criminals whom they say they dislike. So why this issue? Well, existing public support. People are already there. We've got an empirical and a moral case that alternatives to criminalisation can reduce the harms of drug policy and drug use for net gain in social welfare and health. We've also got a lack of a correlation between the toughness of law enforcement and the rate of drug use. Now, I put that in brackets because reducing drug use shouldn't really be an objective of drug policy. In Australia, harm minimisation is the objective, and so drug use, a high rate of drug use that is less harmful shouldn't be a problem. Nevertheless, to be able to say, look, there's actually no evidence that being tough on consumers is even reducing the rate of drugs is strategically a big advantage for us. And the final one is that it's achievable within the current conventions. There's a real problem with the regulation of cannabis in that, the USA has been willing, or some states have been willing to go it alone and contravene the UN conventions. That I think is achievable in Australia as well, but let's just say that it's that there are still some barriers or obstacles there to cannabis regulation, for example. All right, but so what does all this mean for how we speak to people? Well, first up, okay, people don't like the idea of regular drug use. They don't like the term legalise, but they're also not. They also don't agree with the idea that the status quo is working. They do like the idea of removing criminal penalties. It's not because they want to protect people's liberties, but they do want to address concerns that they have about drugs through better alternatives. So these, I think, point towards some of the messages that are going to cut through to the many thousands of people who don't like us, love cannabis, but whom we need to mobilise into the movement to make change. All right, so at this point, I just want to compare some of this, some of those kind of messaging opportunities, I suppose, with some lessons from the USA. So this is a chart where you can see all the states in blue that have regulated cannabis. Can't really see Washington, DC, because it's kind of small. But so we've got 5 US states now, including Alaska down on the left. And the others indicate ones where there is medical cannabis, regulated medical cannabis, or removal of criminal penalties for cannabis possession. So, very encouraging picture. Be good to see some more blue. This chart is showing right now. Okay, this is US attitudes towards legalizing cannabis for personal consumption. So, 2012 saw the first successful balloted initiatives for regulated cannabis. That was about the point where nationally opinions crossed the 50% mark, which is actually budged from the 50% point, and it's been reformatted here. But nevertheless, imagine that's at 50%. About 2012, it crossed that point. In Australia, we are sitting at 32% right now, which is about where the US was 12 years ago. I didn't have the data prior to here, but the chart would, we didn't have that dip that the United States had. It's actually been about 30% in Australia for almost like the 15 to 20 years prior to what's shown here. But yeah, bear in mind, so we're 12 years behind the States in terms of when they got to regulated cannabis from where we are now in terms of public opinion. So when we start comparing the US with Australia, of course, they're very different countries. In the United States, reform was possible through ballot initiatives. That's not going to happen here. We're going to have reform through parliamentary initiatives. There's much more autonomy for the states in the US. And there's also a US national exceptionalism. Like the United States sees itself as different from all other countries in the world, which we don't have. We have less autonomy for the states, and also we're, I think, less likely to contravene UN conventions. The US had high levels of funding and campaign infrastructure, which just doesn't exist here in Australia right now. The Washington State campaign for regulated cannabis spent about $6 million on advertising. And that was just to shift opinions about 4 or 5% to get them over the line, to get the bill passed. The US, of course, also has long-standing medical cannabis regulation. Ours is, let's say, very new. And the US also had this very high-profile issue of the incarceration of people, especially for drug possession offences, which we do not have. We have quite low levels of incarceration. Okay. So bear that in mind. I'm going to work through some messages from the USA and then make some conclusions about what it means for here. So there's some great research that's been done into what worked, especially this particular paper was funded by the Open Society Foundation. It looks at the cannabis regulation campaigns in Washington State, in Colorado, and in Oregon, which failed, and draws out some of the messages for campaigning elsewhere. Sorry, the conclusions for campaigning elsewhere. All right. I've summarized this very briefly using smiley faces. These are messages that worked. Okay, people are not really interested in hearing about the effects of prohibition and what happened back when the United States made alcohol illegal. They're not really interested in that. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Sorry, effects of prohibition. They're have very negative perceptions of what prohibition has achieved, drug prohibition has achieved right now. So they're very ready for messages about, for example, the failure of high levels of incarceration. But people don't like recreational cannabis. Most people don't smoke cannabis, and many people have negative perceptions of cannabis use. They have very positive perceptions of the idea of strong regulation, very negative perceptions of the idea that ideology should shape policy. Ideology as they understand it. What they love is hypothecation, which is a fancy way of saying the tax revenue we get from cannabis sales will be spent on things like treatment services or building schools like it is in Colorado. People love that stuff. Protecting youth, messages about protecting youth. They love that. That's what they're worried about. They're worried about their kids. If you can say this is going to be a better way of protecting your kids, that comes through saving law enforcement time and money, increasing tax revenue, taking money out of the hands of criminals, all those things really cut through to people. Cannabis safer in alcohol. Now that's something that a lot of us will be familiar with from the very high-profile Colorado campaign that Marijuana Policy Project ran. They said, you know, cannabis is safer than alcohol and therefore should be regulated. They liked that message, it was important to them, didn't actually really cut through with voters that much. Here is what this turns out like. This is what cannabis regulation advertising in the United States look like. Alex Wodak always talks about how middle-aged mums with pearls on are going to be the people who make drug law reform happen, and here's one right here. So you can read that message, but essentially this is a TV ad with a mum saying, I don't like cannabis, but this is a much better alternative to address the concerns that I have. That's why I support the bill. So that was the Washington State Cannabis Regulation. All right. And then here are some examples of the campaign materials from the Washington, D.C. bill. And these are Drug Policy Alliance's materials. So here it's not about, hey, cannabis, what a fantastic thing it is. It's about, well, on here with the racial disparity in arrest rates, and over here some of the costs that come with being criminalised for being a cannabis consumer. In this case, it's talking about how it diminishes your job opportunities. All right. Similarly, like another great piece of research that we can draw on is another one also done by the Drug Policy Alliance. And this is just a little first slide from their presentation. This is some strategic messaging research they did back in 2011. So it's not just cannabis regulation, it's talking about the war on drugs and drug reform in general. Their conclusion was they found that people from the left and the right showed a strong preference for war on drugs type messages at the start of the research. They were right there, they love that stuff, you know. But their minds can be changed. If you've got the right combination of messages, you can actually bring people across. So what are those messages? Okay, people don't like linear arguments. They do not want to hear the rational account of why whatever you're proposing is going to be a much better thing for them. What they like are associations of, what are called heuristic cues, knowing that a particular issue is, a particular side in the debate is supported by people like them, that's what they like. Comparing this issue to something else that they also have positive opinions about, that's the kind of stuff they like. Historical messages, people are not so interested in. But new solutions, you know, we can deal with your concerns better kind of stuff, they love that. The idea of evidence-based strategies, reducing harm and addiction, protecting kids and spending money wisely, all those things are messages that people respond positively to. Medicalising the problem, people are not so responsive to. You know, things like we should take this out of the hands of police and put it in the hands of the medical profession doesn't really cut through, at least not in the United States. And they're not interested in protecting liberties, even in the US where there's such a strong civil liberties tradition, which we don't have in Australia, so I would assume that that frowny face would be even frownier here. Okay, so in thinking about what conclusions or like what conclusions do we draw from the United States, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the task that we've got is different from the one that they had. They were trying to convince undecided voters on ballot initiatives to support a particular side. So they're always aiming their communications at the undecided voters. And so it's always those messages, you know, like the mum with the pearls. Women aged 30 to 50 was one of their main target categories because they were very easily swayed by the opposition. So, yeah. Whereas in Australia, we don't have the $6 million budget to run television advertising campaigns. And getting an 8% change in attitudes isn't actually going to change anything because we don't have ballot initiatives. At least it's not going to change anything in the very direct way that it could in the US. So in thinking about like what lessons to draw from the USA, we also have to remember that we're not just speaking to those undecided voters, we're actually trying to mobilize people into a movement. So the messages that make sense for people who are actually going to get involved in making change are going to be a little different from the mum with the pearls. In fact, they're probably going to be quite different, but they have to work for the mum with the pearls too. Okay, so summarising, some implications for reform in Australia. There's a strong strategic, empirical and moral case for campaigning around ending the criminalisation of drug users. We've got people there already. Campaigning for cannabis regulation, which I 100% support, is important, but that reform faces more substantial challenges and barriers. Public attitudes are one, but the United Nations Conventions, just to name two, is another substantial one. The social movement is going to be necessary here to make change. We need to engage big groups, big coalitions in making change, and so the case for reform has got to engage supporters. It's got to engage those people who are going to be the first ones to say, yes, I give a shit about this so much that I'm actually going to take action. But in order to make change, Like, to actually get where we want to get, we're going to need big and diverse coalitions, and we're going to need politicians. They'll be the change makers, and so the messages that we use and the ways that we present the issues have got to appeal to those people too. And that is the end. So I'm from Unharm. We are a organisation that more and more is becoming the organisation we're meant to be, which is a digital campaigning organisation. So if I can just do a little advertorial, one of the things we're really looking for is opportunities to test out campaign ideas. So if there are campaigns that you're interested in, that you want to see, does this actually resonate with people? Like, can we tell a story that connects up with the moment that means that this turns into a petition that 10,000 people sign? Please get in touch, www.unharm.org. We're very happy to work with anyone and everyone on identifying opportunities for campaigning in Australia. And that is the end. If you've got any questions, please do.
Yeah, many of us will have seen this poster that's been put out for MardiGrass. It's headed, "My dealer is my healer." Would you agree that this sort of sloganeering is likely to advantage the anti-cannabis lobby, because it feeds into their hands that if you legalise cannabis, you're going to force medicinal cannabis users, medical users, into the arms of the black market?
Okay, so when we're thinking about communication, there are all sorts of different audiences, and messages need to be tailored to the particular audience. That message, I think, is very appropriate to an audience here in Nimbin, and you know, I think I carried the "My dealer is my healer" banner in the parade last year. That message is not going to be as resonant for the mum with the pearls. So it's about knowing the audience. I don't think it's a harmful message, no.
Very good presentation. I really appreciate it. One point I would make in regards to the recreational use is, I think it was, 2012 that it passed in Canada, and in Colorado, and in Washington. But recognize it was 1996 when medical became legal in California, and I've been doing medical marijuana stuff since 2001, and I've seen a dramatic change in the attitude of the mainstream as we've taken the mystery away. So having the medical come first is helpful in demystifying and demonizing. I mean, I think jumping right to recreational is a bigger step than going medical first and then recreational. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the really clear example of that is the Colorado campaign versus the Washington State campaign, where Colorado had this almost like best practice in terms of medical cannabis, a great, highly regulated, well-run medical cannabis system, I suppose. And the recreational cannabis reforms essentially built on that foundation, because people could already see that this was a drug that could be effectively regulated. And so, yeah, it made sense. There were shops. Why not let them sell them recreationally? So, yeah, I mean, Colorado, and that's why I think Colorado, I mean, they spent between $2 and $3 million on the ballot initiative. In Washington State, it cost about twice as much money, and the messages needed to be different because there wasn't that foundation. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, I agree that it provides a foundation. If people can see this works, the sky doesn't fall, absolutely it helps.
Hi mate. I used to live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and statistically what the government did there, it obviously got out of control, and then they kind of let go and then they decriminalised it. Statistically, if you look at it, drug use in Holland is a lot lower than the rest of Europe. Now, do you think with politicians, like ignorance plays
Yeah, I know. So more Australians smoke cannabis than people in the Netherlands, even though they have, coffee shops where you can purchase cannabis legally. Yeah, and there have been multiple research studies that show, there's no correlation between being tough on cannabis or drug consumers and reduced drug consumption rates. But I think we can all agree that it's never been the case that drug policy has been based on scientific evidence. And so I think that expecting people to respond to rational arguments about the evidence, I don't think that that's the way forward. It's not how people work. We have habitual ways of thinking about particular issues. No one who isn't involved in cannabis law reform or drug law reform sits at home thinking, what is my position on the criminalisation of consumers? You don't do that. They just have habitual ways of thinking about the issue, and it's only when something shifts either the emotional, when there's something, an emotion that they feel that interrupts that habitual way of thinking, or if their setting is changed, if they are in a different mental or physical space, that's when you get changed. So it will be more emotive stories like we saw with the Haslams, with medical cannabis. That's where the opportunity is, rather than saying the evidence. All right, thank you very much.